Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Chris Letheby. He is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Western Australia and a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Adelaide. He is a philosopher of mind and cognitive science, working on issues arising from the use of psychedelic drugs in psychiatry and neuroscience. And today we're going to focus on his book, Philosophy of Psychedelics. So, Dr. Letheby, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks, Ricardo. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so what kinds of questions does the philosophy of psychedelics deal with?
Yeah, so the philosophy of psychedelics, as you know, a sort of self-conscious subfield going by that name, is still emerging, and we're still waiting to see exactly what it turns out to be. But there are a lot of fascinating philosophical questions that arise in relation to psychedelics. So, three of the main ones, I guess, that I've focused on so far have been, first of all, what is the epistemic status of the psychedelic experience? In other words, the knowledge-related status. So one of the most striking facts about psychedelic experiences that people often claim to have gained some kind of knowledge from these drug-induced states. And knowledge, of course, is a perennial concern of philosophers. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that studies knowledge, its nature, and the conditions of its acquisition, and so on. So that is one sort of set of issues, the set of issues concerning the epistemic status of the psychedelic state. Another one is sort of, I guess, philosophy of mind. So you've got, yeah, epistemological issues about psychedelics. You've got issues in the philosophy of mind. So, of course, people on psychedelics have lots of remarkable and unusual experiences that are often very far from ordinary waking consciousness. And so the question most broadly is, what can we learn about the mind from studying those experiences and from thinking seriously about them? And the most sort of, well, the version of that question that's attracted the most interest to date and that I've focused on is what can we learn about the nature of self and self-awareness from studying experiences in which the sense of self seems to undergo radical and remarkable changes. And then another cluster of issues I've focused on has to do with the nature of spirituality. So, I mean, a lot of philosophers at the moment are interested in the possibility of a naturalistic spirituality, the idea that there might be something like a spirituality that doesn't depend on the sort of metaphysical ideas that traditionally go along with institutional religion. And so one question is whether the psychedelic experience, the effects of psychedelics, has anything to teach us about that. But I mean, there are many other questions as well, you know. I mean, psychedelics as objects of scientific research raise a lot of interesting issues in the philosophy of science. As psychiatric treatments, they raise issues in the philosophy of psychiatry. So their use in various contexts for various purposes raises ethical issues, of course. So, yeah, I mean, the philosophy of psychedelics really is the attempt to analyze and understand psychedelics and all their various uses and effects with an eye to all these sorts of philosophical issues.
So let's try to go through some of those domains. We will probably not have enough time to go through all of them, but starting with epistemology. So, I mean, what are you trying to understand there when it comes to the epistemology of psychedelics? Are you trying to understand if the sorts of knowledge people report having access to have after experiencing some sort of I mean, for example, mystical experience related to the use of psychedelics, if it grants them access to real knowledge? Is that it?
Yeah, well, I mean, the broadest question is simply, is there some kind of knowledge, some kind of substantial and interesting knowledge that it's possible to gain through the use of psychedelics? And if so, what kind or kinds of knowledge and how is it possible to gain it? And yeah, traditionally, I mean, one of the most common epistemological claims about psychedelics has been that yes, you can gain knowledge through their use. You can gain metaphysical knowledge about, say, the nature of ultimate reality, the existence of a godhead, a cosmic consciousness, or a universal mind, or even a realm of sort of disembodied spirits or something like this. And of course, psychedelics have long histories of use by various indigenous cultures in sort of religious, ritual, ceremonial contexts, and at least since the 1960s, they've also been used for religious or spiritual, neo-religious purposes in the Western world. And yeah, this is one of the most common claims, that through using them, you can gain some sort of direct, unmediated knowledge of the existence and the nature of a divine reality or a metaphysical spiritual realm or something like this.
And is there any way for us to be sure that's the case?
Well, so yeah, I mean, the idea of being sure is, in a sense, the wrong place to focus. So it's sort of a widespread view these days in epistemology, as I say, the philosophical study of knowledge, that knowledge itself doesn't require certainty. And certainly the subjective feeling of certainty, feeling that you personally are sure about something, is neither necessary nor sufficient for actually having knowledge. And this is one of the points that is very important to bear in mind when considering epistemological issues about psychedelics. But if we ask, is it really true that people gain knowledge about a cosmic consciousness or a spirit world through taking psychedelics? My answer is no, they don't, because I accept a philosophical view known as naturalism, which essentially says the natural world is all there is. There is no such thing as a cosmic mind or a disembodied mind or a spirit realm or something like that. So if you adopt that sort of position, then those sorts of claims to gain knowledge of that kind from a psychedelic experience simply have to be false. And so is another question about why you might hold the sort of view that I do, and why not actually take psychedelic experiences themselves as evidence, right? So why not take it, the fact that people have these extremely powerful, compelling, convincing experiences in which they seem to directly encounter a godhead or a cosmic consciousness or a spirit realm, why not take that as compelling evidence that such things really do exist? And the short answer, in my opinion, is just that there are simpler explanations available, right? I think we can, in principle, explain fully why people have experiences of those kinds without needing to suppose that the sorts of things they're seeming to experience are actually real. You know, we can give, and we don't have all the details yet, you know, the scientific and philosophical study of psychedelics is in its early days, but it seems to me that, yeah, we can in principle explain the experiences that people have as of a cosmic consciousness and as of a spirit world without needing to invoke the idea that a cosmic consciousness or a spirit world actually exists. And so then you follow the principle of parsimony, Occam's razor, prefer the simpler explanation that adequately explains the phenomenon.
So when it comes to the psychiatric use of these kinds of drugs, do we know about the experiences psychedelic patients tend to have and the sort of effects they experience?
Yeah, we know a certain amount, although we need to know a lot more, and the effort is kind of underway to start probing the details of these experiences in more detail. I mean, one of the most robust findings in the scientific study of the therapeutic use of psychedelics has been that good outcomes, and so by now we've seen clinical trials using psychedelics to treat various different conditions, so anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, various forms of substance use disorders, and the most consistent finding is that good outcomes, so lasting reductions in psychiatric symptoms, tend to be predicted by this specific construct of a mystical type experience. And you get the same sort of finding too in studies of healthy subjects. So when you get people without a psychiatric diagnosis and give them psychedelic experiences under supervised controlled conditions, you see things like lasting increases in well-being and personality change and so on. And again, commonly, these are all predicted by the occurrence of this specific type of experience, the so-called mystical type experience during the drug action. So, you know, on the basis of that quantitative finding, it's very tempting to think, well, we do know quite a bit about the sorts of experiences that people are having. And the notion that's being used there, the notion of a mystical type experience, originally derives from the work of philosophers, psychologists like William James and Walter Stace, and it's been developed into these kind of well-validated psychometric questionnaires. And it's supposed to capture this sort of experience of oneness, cosmic unity, you know, this experience that allegedly is reported across times, places, cultures, different religious traditions, in which essentially the sense of being a separate individual self dissolves and is replaced by a sense of kind of boundless union with some timeless, spaceless, divine ultimate reality or ground of being. And that's the sort of experience that these psychometric questionnaires are designed to capture. So you might think, well, this is what we know. We know that lots of people who get given high doses of psychedelics in controlled conditions have that kind of experience, and that's the kind of experience that leads to the positive therapeutic outcomes. But as you'll know, having read my book, I think the picture is a bit more complicated. So I don't know if you want me to sort of keep going straight into the complications.
Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So basically, what I think is that if we look a bit more closely, a crucial source of evidence becomes qualitative research. So there have been a number of really good studies now that involve conducting interviews, qualitative interviews with patients who have undergone this form of therapy, who have been treated successfully and had their symptoms remit for a period of time. And I think when you look more closely at that, this idea that everyone who's getting treated successfully is having a full-blown mystical experience as it's classically understood, experience of apparent union with the divine ultimate reality and total dissolution of the self. It doesn't hold water, right? Because those classical sort of mystical experiences that William James and Walter Stace were talking about, they're extremely overwhelming, extremely compelling and convincing. And I think it's a fair assumption that most of the time, if somebody had had an experience of that kind, they would be talking about it. But then when you look at the qualitative interviews, you find that a lot of people who have been successfully treated are in fact not talking about anything like that. They're not really emphasizing anything to do with divine union or religious or metaphysical epiphany at all. Instead, you find them talking about things like experiences of renewed connectedness, feelings of connection to other people, to the earth, to the natural world, to their own body, experiences of kind of acceptance, emotional catharsis, psychological insight, changes in how they see themselves and how they see certain situations in their lives. So you get all these themes that, are quite compatible with the kind of naturalistic worldview that I hold, and that don't really seem to have much of anything to do with the union with the divine. And so the kind of what's the word I'm looking for? The twist, right? What I think explains this apparent conflict between the qualitative findings and the quantitative findings, right? The fact that you've got this construct of a mystical type experience consistently predicting good outcomes, and yet you've got all these people who aren't really talking about cosmic union or divine reality, is basically that these psychometric questionnaires cast a broad net, right? So the construct of a mystical type experience is defined as, well, different measures. It's defined in different ways, but one of them, the mystical experience questionnaire, it's like basically you're deemed to have had a complete mystical type experience if you score 60% or more on all of these 7 subscales. And there are certain cases, Michael Pollan is one in his book on psychedelics, that make it very clear that it's possible for someone to have an experience on psychedelics where they go away and they fill out the questionnaire and they do tick those boxes. They do score above the cutoff for all of those things, even though the experience really wasn't anything with apparent metaphysical implications. It wasn't anything where they seemed to experience a cosmic consciousness. So the disconnect or the apparent incoherence has partly to do with the way the questionnaires themselves are worded and partly to do with the way people are interpreting them. But yeah, that's I think a cautionary message about how we interpret findings that are using these questionnaires. Is like, just because somebody has ticked all the boxes, they've satisfied the psychometric definition of a complete mystical type experience, it doesn't follow from that that they've actually had something that William James or Walter Stace would recognize as a full-blown mystical experience in the classic sense. And my belief is that, yeah, most people who are having therapeutically beneficial, moderate to high dose psychedelic experiences are not in fact having full-blown mystical experiences in the classical sense with all these these apparent metaphysical implications, even though they are satisfying the psychometric definition of a complete mystical type experience.
So, since you have a naturalistic approach to all of this, I would imagine that in trying to understand how these experiences are induced, you would be interested in the sort of neurobiological, neurochemical side of things. Do we have good enough knowledge of that?
We have some knowledge. I don't think we really have good enough knowledge yet. I mean, psychedelic neuroimaging is just a very kind of contested, controversial field. Like, very few things are known securely. I mean, we've got enough findings to start making some informed conjectures, as various people have done. And, you know, I make a few conjectures as well in my book, sort of drawing on the work of others. But I think it's fair to say that all of these, you know, the more kind of neurobiologically specific something is at the present point, the more kind of conjectural and tentative and provisional it is. And it's, you know, absolutely certain that all these, you know, neurobiological models are going to be kind of revised and refined as we go along. But yeah, I mean, there are a few things that stand out. Perhaps to some extent these things stand out because we're looking for them, but there are a couple of systems in the brain, a couple of brain networks. So I should say, first off, on the kind of level of neuropharmacology, we understand pretty well by now how classic psychedelics work. So the class of drugs that I study, which doesn't include ketamine and MDMA and things like this, it's just the classic serotonergic psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, DMT, mescaline, these kinds of things. Basically, the evidence is pretty strong that at the neuropharmacological level, they all work by acting at this particular receptor subtype, the serotonin 2A receptor. And, you know, there are all these findings showing that their affinity for that receptor correlates with how potent they are at inducing a psychedelic state. And, you know, if you pre-treat people with a selective blocker of that receptor, you find it abolishes the majority of the psychedelic effects. So at that level, even though there are still some questions unanswered, we've got a pretty good handle on what's going on. But it's the bit in the middle, you know, it's how that kind of agonist action at that one neurotransmitter receptor subtype leads to the kinds of experiences we've been talking about that is still very incompletely understood. But at that level, when we're looking at like widespread sort of systems neuroscience, what kind of systems throughout the brain are getting affected and what functions do they engage in, there are these two networks that stand out again and again, and one that sort of has copped the lion's share of the attention so far is the default mode network, which has been a very big deal in neuroscience in the last 20 years. So this system that kind of seems to be more active either when we're sitting around not really doing anything in conditions of wakeful rest, or when we engage in specific types of cognitive tasks, usually things that are somehow self-referential or social or introspective, something to do with modeling our own minds or modeling the minds of others. These are the kinds of tasks that tend to activate the default mode network, and then it tends to deactivate when we start engaging in some task that is impersonal or externally focused, involving doing something in the external world. So it's been linked to, you know, mind wandering, rumination, so-called theory of mind, you know, attributing mental states to others, sense of self, what's called the narrative or autobiographical sense of self, our kind of sense of our own personality and life history and trajectory. And then the other network, which doesn't get talked about quite as much, is the salience network, which, as its name suggests, has been linked to kind of attributing salience or meaningfulness or importance to stimuli. So the idea is that one function of this network is, out of all the kinds of internal and external stimuli that the brain is getting bombarded with, to kind of pick out the ones that are important and that need attention and that need to kind of demand our resources, and in some ways to control switching. You know, if we're kind of focused internally and then we need to switch our attention externally because something important is happening out there, or vice versa, the thought is this network might be involved in switching between the relevant systems, perhaps switching between the default mode network and other systems. And interestingly, the salience network has also been linked to the sense of self, right? So while the default mode network gets linked to this kind of narrative, autobiographical, this fairly high level sort of self-concept, people tend to link the salience network to a much more minimal, or as it's sometimes called, embodied sense of self, you know, the sense of being an embodied organism, having an experience right now that is kind of prior to any ideas you might have about who you are and what sort of traits you have in your history and so on. So yeah, so those are the, and exactly in what way these systems are affected by psychedelics seems to vary quite a bit. And in some ways it's not surprising, because you've got all these different populations, you know, people with various different diagnoses, healthy subjects, and they're getting given different doses of different drugs in different conditions. All of them, if we know anything about what's going on in their brain, all of them are sort of in neuroimaging scanners or wearing, you know, EEG caps or something, but then they're all using different imaging methods as well. So it's not surprising that it's been really hard to get consensus. But yeah, that seems to be a common theme that emerges, is the effects of psychedelics, and in particular their effects on the sense of self and their therapeutic effects, seem again and again to correlate with some kind of alteration to these two networks.
So, since at the beginning of the interview you mentioned that one type of questions you're interested in the philosophy of psychedelics has to do with changes to the sense of self. I mean, you've already mentioned some of that during our conversation, but could you tell us more about what are the changes to the sense of self that psychedelics induce, the ones you're interested in, and perhaps how they connect to other aspects of human psychology?
Yeah, sure. So this is one of the really interesting and distinctive effects of psychedelics. I mean, one of the facts about psychedelics that makes studying them so kind of interesting and challenging is just how variable their effects are, right? So their effects are far more variable than those of other drugs, and it's because they're affected very strongly by set and setting, as it's called. So the psychological state of the person taking the drug and the environment in which they take it. So in some ways, if you talk about the experiential effects of psychedelics, it's kind of hard to generalize. But Alan Watts, who, you know, took psychedelics and wrote and talked a lot about them, among his other interests, said that, you know, there are two changes that are common enough to be considered characteristic of the psychedelic experience, and these are the sense of slowed or arrested time and the alteration to ego boundaries, or the sense of self. So this is one of the kind of common effects that you get, especially at sort of higher doses, moderate to high doses. You won't necessarily get anything that's recognizable as this at kind of lower doses, but it can take a lot of different forms, right? And so this is one of the things that is interesting in itself. I mean, we've already figured that out independently, but if we hadn't figured this out through other means, one of the main lessons of studying psychedelics would be that human self-awareness is a complex and multifaceted thing, right? So sometimes people might describe having the experience of bodily boundaries dissolving. You know, it becomes less clear to them where the point is in space, where their body ends and the rest of the world begins. Other times you might have changes to what's called the experience of body ownership. So you might sort of see your body and have the sense that this body isn't mine. You kind of lose the sense of actually owning or inhabiting the body and can view it as sort of almost an alien or a foreign object. You can also lose that sense of ownership over thoughts, right? So you can have the experience where there are thoughts occurring in the mind, but you don't have any sense that they're your thoughts. Likewise, you can lose the sense of agency over thoughts and actions. So you can have the experience where actions are being performed or thoughts are being thought, but you don't have the sense that you're the one doing them or you're the one thinking them. So all these different complex kind of alterations. And I think therapeutically, you know, one of the most interesting and relevant ones is the one where you have this kind of disidentification with thoughts, right? There is this sort of felt sense of distance from mental events. It's like the self and the thoughts and feelings are somehow not necessarily alienated, but they're separated so that you can kind of have this detached and, you know, seemingly very clear perspective and watch what is going on in your mind without being totally tangled up and caught up in it. But then, you know, at higher doses, you can get much more radical alterations to self-consciousness. And so the two basic questions, you know, if you want to ask philosophical questions about psychedelics in the self, there's essentially it gets more complicated, but on a basic level, there's a metaphysical question and there's a phenomenological question, right? So metaphysically, the question is, well, does the self actually exist? I mean, this obviously is a topic that philosophers have debated for a long time. Is there really any such thing as a self or not? And you might think that somehow the psychedelic experience gives you some evidence, gives you some support for a particular answer to that question. And then there is this phenomenological question, this question about experience, which is the sense of self, so setting aside for now whether there really is any such thing or entity as the self, the sense of self, the feeling of being a self, is that actually something that is necessary for conscious experience, which is a view that a lot of thinkers have taken, or can there actually be conscious experiences that completely lack any sense of self, that have absolutely no feeling whatsoever that there's someone the experience is happening to? So yeah, those are the two basic issues. Does the self exist, and can there be states of conscious experience without any form of self-consciousness? And that second one is very tricky, right? Because it's not always clear how to interpret people's reports. But certainly at high doses, you get reports that at first glance look very much like that's what they're describing. You know, people do say things like, all sense of self was gone. I no longer, well, often they won't even use the word I, as Raphael Millier and others have pointed out. This is one of the telling things. Often people, in describing these experiences retrospectively, will be very reluctant to use the first person pronoun, and they'll say things like, there was experience happening, but there was no one it was happening to. There was no point of reference, no perspective. And so, yeah, as I say, it gets complicated, but at least at first glance, there are sort of high dose psychedelic experience reports that seem very much to be describing conscious experiences without any form of self-awareness.
Mhm. And does that connect in any way to autobiographical changes people experience?
Yeah, I think autobiographical changes. So yeah, it's a view of mine, a view that I defend in the book, of course, that the main thing that is driving improvements in psychedelic therapy and reductions in psychiatric symptoms is changes to the so-called narrative self or autobiographical self. So yeah, people kind of getting an opportunity afforded by the drugs and the drug-induced experience to actually revise their conception, their kind of story about who they are, into a healthier, more flexible, perhaps more realistic version. And so the question is, yeah, does that sort of change relate to the kinds of experiences I'm describing? I think in some ways it doesn't really relate that much to the full-blown, totally selfless episodes. I think the sorts of experiences that are good candidates for a total loss of self-awareness are, first of all, quite rare, and secondly, not necessarily of great direct therapeutic value. I think when that sort of experience does have therapeutic value, it's because it kind of gives, well, it induces this quality that, again, I talk about in the book called phenomenal opacity, right? So it enables people to recognize their mental representations of the world as representations rather than just being totally caught up in them, totally seduced by them, and simply mistaking them for reality itself. So, you know, there's an account that I always remember from someone who had psilocybin in a trial for smoking cessation, and they described, I can't remember the exact words, but they said there was just this one moment where I was just me without any attributes. And they said that helped me realize that I'm not a smoker, that, you know, the attribute of being a smoker isn't something essential to who or what I am. Now, even that to me doesn't sound like an experience of total loss of self-awareness, because they said, you know, I'm just me. So to me, what that sounds like is a state in which the narrative or autobiographical self has completely gone for a moment, you know, so all sense of which specific person I am and which attributes I have has gone, but there's still that minimal sense of self. There's still some sense of a me or I actually having the experience, some entity undergoing the experience. And the therapeutic value in that account seems to me precisely to be that it separates the two, right? It shows that, you know, the experiencing entity that you are can actually be distinguished from this story that you have about all the particular roles and attributes and behaviors and so on that you have. And it is possible for the more fundamental, minimal you to actually remain while those more complex narrative structures are actually changed and revised and dissolved. So it kind of frees people from their kind of rigid stories about who they are that they may be trapped in, by showing them directly that, you are not that. You are not that story. You can exist in its absence. But yeah, as I say, I think most of those kinds of cases are not plausibly ones where you actually have a total loss of self-awareness. So yeah, I actually think the therapeutically relevant changes to autobiographical or narrative self on the one hand, and then these apparent episodes of sort of total loss of self-awareness on the other, are reasonably independent. The main connection, of course, is that they both are modifications of self-awareness of some kind.
So, I mean, at the beginning we were talking about the epistemology of psychedelics, let's say, but with these kinds of psychological effects they have, are these experiences good enough sources of evidence for us to really be able to answer questions like, does the self exist? And if really the kinds of narratives people tend to develop for their lives are correspond to anything real or not, for example?
Yeah. So, yeah, there's a couple of different questions there. So when it comes to the metaphysical issue, the basic philosophical question, does the self exist? Are psychedelic experiences good enough sources of evidence to answer that question? Certainly not on their own, right? I mean, if we want to answer that question, we have to appeal to a wide body of evidence and considerations. I've argued in earlier work that psychedelic experience can be relevant, right? And this is just because if we want to answer a question like, does the self exist? In some sense, we need to know what we mean by self. And this is a very sort of classic strategy in analytic philosophy, right? The idea is that if you want to answer some question about reality, some metaphysical question, first you need to define your terms. You need to answer the conceptual question of what exactly would the thing you're talking about be if it were to exist. And so an example of this strategy in action is the error theory of morality developed by J.L. Mackie, the late Australian philosopher. So Mackie famously argued that morality is a myth, that basically when we engage in moral talk about things being right and wrong and so on, we're actually committing a systematic error. We're making all these claims about how reality is that are simply false. But what's interesting about the way Mackie proceeds is it goes in two parts. There's first of all the conceptual or the semantic part where he asks, well, when we think our ordinary moral thoughts and we talk our ordinary moral talk, when we think things like murder is wrong and giving to charity is good and say things like that, what exactly is the content of those thoughts and those utterances? What are we really saying about reality? And Mackie's analysis was that what we're saying is essentially what, earlier philosophers ranging from Plato to G.E. Moore had said, that, there is some independent, objective fact in the world that one ought not to murder or one ought to give to charity. And it's kind of, that's the way things are, no matter what anyone thinks about it, that moral facts are really just like physical facts. They're this kind of mind-independent, objective feature of the world. So this is the first step in Mackie's project, as he says, when we think about, rightness and wrongness, things being right and wrong, what we're really thinking about and what we're really claiming is that there are these objective prescriptions, as he called it, these kind of objective states of affairs in the world that actually are binding on us irrespective of our own beliefs and desires and so on. And then the second part of his project is to say, look, that's totally weird. There's no way there could be anything like that. So that's when he actually gets into the metaphysics of morals, if you like, and draws his famous or infamous nihilistic conclusion that, our moral discourse is shot through with this error. But that's the strategy, is first to ask, well, what would the world have to be like for something like morality to exist, right? What are we even asking about when we ask, are there moral truths or are things right and wrong? And then secondly, you conduct the inquiry into, is there anything out there that actually meets the description? And so this is the kind of way of proceeding that has since been articulated and defended by a lot of analytic philosophers like Frank Jackson. And so my thought was, and I'm not the first person to say this. This kind of reasoning can be found, especially in the work of Thomas Metzinger, that experiences like this, altered states of consciousness, like the ones psychedelics induce, can help us with the first part of the project. Right? The thought is, if we want to answer the question, does the self exist? First, we need to answer the conceptual or the semantic question: what do we mean by self? Right? What would there have to be in reality for it to be true that the self exists? And then secondly, we go and look at reality and ask, is there anything that fits the description? Is there anything like that there? And the thought is that the study of psychedelic experiences might be able to help us answer the first question. If we look systematically at the contrast between ordinary, sober, waking experience and the sorts of experiences people have on high doses of psychedelics, then we might be able to pin down what is the content, what is the thing that's gone missing. And so in ordinary waking experience, when we feel that we are selves, when I feel that I am an I or a me, what exactly is the content of that? What is the kind of thing that I feel like I am? And so in a paper with Phil Gerrans, in which we talked about the experience of ego dissolution under psychedelics, we argued that the evidence from studying psychedelics can help to support an anti-realist conclusion about the self. It can help to support the conclusion that the self does not exist. Why? Because we argued that the best way to explain the contrast between ordinary waking experience and psychedelic experience is to say, well, we actually experience ourselves in ordinary sober waking consciousness. We experience ourselves as something like Cartesian egos, right? Something like the kind of simple, persisting, indivisible self that Descartes talked about, this sort of substantial entity that is distinct from all of its physical and mental states. It's distinct from the body, but it stands to them in these intimate relations. It's the thing that experiences the experiences, that thinks the thoughts, that feels the feelings, and it's literally the exact very same self that's present now that was present 5 years ago or 10 years ago or whatever. So yeah, Philip and I argued that the study of psychedelic experiences supports the conclusion that that is actually the content of our self-representations, that human beings typically, and this is not necessarily transparent to us introspectively, right? It's not as though we can just kind of look within and ask, well, what sort of thing am I taking myself to be? Because it's always there. The thought is, this sense of being a self like that is so constant, it's so ubiquitous that we can't really notice it. It's kind of just part of the background. And so it only becomes clear when it's gone, when we've got that phenomenal contrast, is the term that the philosopher Susanna Siegel introduced for this method. So you have the phenomenal contrast, the experiential contrast between what it's like when you have the sense of self and what it's like when it's gone. And that enables you, according to mine and Philip's arguments, to draw the conclusion that, yeah, when we experience ourselves as selves, we experience ourselves as something like a Cartesian ego. And then this bit doesn't really have anything to do with psychedelics, but the metaphysical part is just to say, well, there are no Cartesian egos. No one's ever found one. It's completely impossible to square the existence of one with what we know about how the brain and body operate. But yeah, that's where the psychedelic evidence would come in. So it would play a sort of relatively minor but potentially important role in the first part of that two-part inquiry into the existence of the self.
So, does psychedelic therapy or the general use of psychedelics involve epistemic risks?
I think it does, and I think the exact extent and nature of those risks is not yet clear, right? So the main sorts of epistemic risks that I have focused on to date is the acquisition of kind of highly convincing non-naturalistic beliefs. So beliefs in the existence of a cosmic consciousness or a spirit world or something like that. Obviously, I consider these epistemic risks because I'm a naturalist, so I think all those sorts of beliefs are false. And, other people have sort of raised this sort of worry as well. So Michael Pollan, in prior to his book, in a New Yorker article that he wrote about the therapeutic use of psychedelics, said, you know, is psychedelic therapy simply foisting a comforting delusion on the sick and dying? Because it looks at first glance as though what the therapeutic use of psychedelics does is, you know, induce these mystical type experiences, and then people acquire some sort of belief in an ultimate reality or a great beyond or something. And especially when you look at their use in palliative care, you know, they're used to treat anxiety, depression, existential distress in terminally ill patients. It's a very intuitive picture of what's going on, that, you know, yeah, people have this deep and profound distress and fear about their impending mortality. They get administered a high dose of psilocybin. They have this profound mystical experience in which they encounter another reality that seemingly awaits us after death. And then they acquire this new belief, and not a mere sort of intellectual belief, but a belief backed by the authority of seemingly direct experience that, you know, there is more to life and that death is not the end. And it's not hard to imagine that that could have profoundly beneficial psychological effects. So, yeah, and so Pollan, like me, is coming from a naturalistic standpoint, according to which acquiring beliefs like that, even though it might be comforting, would be epistemically harmful. You know, coming to believe that there is another reality awaiting us after death would be an epistemic harm, because from a naturalist perspective, it's simply a false belief. Now, let's be naturalists for the moment. Let's adopt my worldview. From this standpoint, yes, the use of psychedelics in therapy does involve epistemic risks, because, you know, if you have a moderate to high dose in clinical conditions that are tailored to induce a mystical type experience, there is a real chance that you will have not just a mystical type experience, but a full-blown classic mystical experience, one with real kind of apparent metaphysical implications, and that you will come away having adopted a newfound belief in other transcendent levels or dimensions of reality. And that, according to naturalists like me, is an epistemic harm. But one of the things I argue in the book, of course, is that even these epistemic risks are not as great as they initially appear, because, as I said earlier, I think it's actually a relatively small proportion of people who have this treatment who are having the full-blown classic mystical experience. I think a lot more people are having the mere mystical type experience, right, which features things like, you know, profound changes to the sense of self and profound feelings of connectedness and meaningfulness and so on, but doesn't necessarily involve any apparent apprehension of a sort of genuine, objective, metaphysical, transcendent dimension to existence. So that's kind of my first point, is that, you know, contrary to appearances, inducing a full-blown mystical experience that tends to then induce non-naturalistic metaphysical beliefs is not really the modus operandi of psychedelic therapy. That's not what it's all about. That kind of thing happens sometimes, right? But what is really needed for therapeutic benefits, and what I think happens more often, is, yeah, the mystical type experience. I mean, it sounds far too disparaging, but we could call it like the mystical experience light or something like that, right? So the version where you're getting changes to the sense of self, you're getting psychological insights, profound feelings of connectedness and meaningfulness, but you're not actually having this compelling experience of seemingly encountering a divine reality or a great beyond that is really metaphysically out there. So that's the thing. And then the other point is that, you know, even when people have experiences with apparent metaphysical implications, it's not as though everyone simply believes those implications uncritically, right? And that is an idea that is easy to get, that, you know, if you have this kind of experience, then you're just going to believe that it's veridical, because there is this kind of trope about mystical experiences that they just, you know, as William James said, they carry a curious authority for after time. There is this trope that, you know, once you've had the full-blown classic mystical experience, you can't help but believe that what you saw was real, because it feels so real. It feels more real than real, as they say, more real than everyday waking life. But I don't think that's universal either, right? I think you can actually find cases where people clearly have had a full-on mystical experience in the classic sense, not just a mystical type experience, and still retain some kind of, you can't just dismiss it. No one who has an experience of that kind, I think, can simply dismiss it and say, well, that's nothing to take seriously. But nor do you necessarily believe it sort of wholeheartedly, automatically and uncritically. You do get people who maintain a sort of cautious agnosticism. So those are two reasons, as I said, looking at those particular epistemic risks as I deem them. Those are two reasons to think that the epistemic risks are smaller than you might have thought. First off, it's not the case that you need to have a classic mystical experience to get the therapeutic benefits. And in fact, evidence so far suggests, I think, that most people don't. And secondly, it seems clear that even when people do have the classic mystical experience, it's still possible for them to reflect on it somewhat critically afterwards and to kind of explore the question in an open-minded way. Do I think that what I encountered was really real or not? And so this is the sort of thing that I think, would be really useful to bring into clinical practice, is not kind of, foisting particular worldviews on people, like much as I might feel like we should sometimes. I don't necessarily think we should tell everyone they have to be naturalists, but I think it would be really good to educate people who are undergoing these experiences about the variety of different frameworks for interpreting them, about the variety of different ways of making sense of them, and sort of arm them with, as many tools as we can. And that might include things like philosophical tools or spiritual tools, but, give them kind of a good toolkit for making sense of these experiences and for really considering for themselves, with appropriate guidance when required, what are the best ways of making sense of the things that have happened to them. Yeah. But, the other point, of course, is that there are potentially other epistemic risks as well. And this is an area that is very, very understudied, right? So we've probably all come across stories of people, outside of clinical settings who have done a little too much acid or a few too many ayahuasca ceremonies and certainly do start to believe some very strange and evidentially under-supported things about the world. And I'm not just talking about non-naturalistic beliefs, I'm talking about beliefs about the everyday empirical world that are really kind of way sort of beyond the epistemic pale. So just far out conspiracy theories and believing they can talk to aliens and things like this. And there hasn't been much evidence, or any evidence perhaps yet, of people forming those kinds of beliefs from psychedelic experiences in clinical settings, but nor do I know that they've really been looked for. So, I mean, there's a whole raft of questions there that could be investigated about, setting aside metaphysical and religious beliefs, what sorts of effects do psychedelic experiences in clinical settings and out of them tend to have on other sorts of beliefs and on people's critical thinking abilities and their belief formation practices. So that's the other part of the answer, is that really the nature and the extent of the epistemic risks there might be are just not really known yet. It's kind of a vast domain that's ripe for further investigation.
So, but I've asked you about the risks. What about the benefits? From a naturalistic perspective, are there any clear-cut epistemic benefits from using psychedelics?
Yeah, I think there absolutely are. And this is, in a way, what I think is fairly distinctive about my position, because historically, I would say the two most common positions have been, yes, you can gain knowledge from psychedelic use, and it's knowledge of metaphysical, non-naturalistic realities, cosmic consciousness, spirit world, etc. Or no, naturalism is true, and therefore you can't gain knowledge from psychedelic experiences. All you can gain is epistemic harm, hallucination, delusion, and so on. And so, I'm trying to steer a middle path and say, naturalism is true, yes, and you can't gain knowledge of ultimate metaphysical realities, but you can still gain significant epistemic benefits from the use of psychedelics, especially when you use them in kind of controlled and intentional ways that are sort of typical of clinical settings and religious settings and so on. And so one possibility has to do with sort of psychological insight. So very often people report having kind of profound insights under the influence about their own minds, their own thoughts and feelings, situations in their life. And I think, very often these kinds of insights are probably accurate. At least some of the time, they're almost certainly false. So it's not as though every time someone has an apparent psychological insight induced by psychedelics, they've gained knowledge. But I think if people are sort of epistemically responsible, if they kind of have the experience, and at the time, of course, the time you're having the experience, that's not the time to reflect critically. You just kind of have to open up and go with it. But if you then come back afterwards and look at what you found, what you came up with during the experience, and assess it critically, evaluate it with input from other people, with input from the therapist if it's a clinical situation, then the end of that process very often can be that you've gained some new knowledge, right? So you've got some kind of apparent insight, you've then taken it away, evaluated it critically, you've decided that it does stack up to reason and evidence, and so then I think in a lot of cases you have actually gained some genuine new knowledge about yourself, about your mind, about your life, whatever it might be. But there are a whole range of other things as well that don't fit into. So, very often when we think about knowledge, we think about what philosophers call propositional knowledge. So knowing certain facts, knowing that Paris is the capital of France, things like this. But there are many other types of knowledge as well, many other types of epistemic benefits. And I think it is in the some of these non-propositional domains that the epistemic benefits of psychedelic use are clearest, right? So obviously one thing that I talk about is knowledge how, right? So we're all familiar with the idea of knowing how to ride a bicycle or knowing how to program a computer or something like that. And so it's a really interesting idea that through therapeutic psychedelic experiences, people might actually be learning how to do something. They might be gaining knowledge how to perform some kind of action or gaining some sort of skill. And so I think the evidence that has been built up, and there's quite a bit of it by now, that psychedelic experiences actually can improve mindfulness capacities. That, a single psychedelic experience can durably elevate someone's capacity to relate to their own thoughts and feelings in a particular way, to take a sort of aware, open, non-reactive stance towards their own mental contents, the thoughts and feelings flowing through their mind. I think that is very suggestive of the acquisition of some kind of knowledge how. And then you've got comments, first-person reports from qualitative interviews where people are saying exactly this. They're saying things like, through the experience, I learned how to deal with my emotions. I learned how to relate to my thoughts in a healthier way. And so, yeah, this is something that I think from a naturalistic standpoint is one of the great epistemic benefits that a therapeutic psychedelic experience can offer, is through having that experience that I was talking about earlier of having some experiential distance being created between the self and its mental states, having this feeling of what it's like to be able to sort of watch one's own thoughts and feelings with some kind of distance, a sense of objectivity, non-reactivity, that can then leave a powerful and lasting impression where, it's almost as though what that mental posture is. You might never have experienced it before, but now you know what it feels like to relate to your own thoughts and feelings, to relate to your own mind in that way, and therefore becomes possible to try and sort of reactivate, to kind of get back into that mental posture afterwards. And very often you see people taking up something like a meditation practice in order to do exactly that, in order to consolidate these kinds of skills that they've gotten a sort of bit of a start on from the psychedelic experience. So there's that. There's some knowledge how, potential knowledge that, or propositional knowledge of a psychological kind. Another one I talk about is knowledge by acquaintance. And so this is one that is conceptually a bit more complicated, but it's fairly intuitive on a basic level. It's just the idea that, you can know about something indirectly through other people's testimony or through book learning or whatever, or you can experience it firsthand directly for yourself. I can kind of read all about Ricardo Lopez and, read about his YouTube channel and all this stuff. And then I can, well, obviously we're not getting directly acquainted. There's some mediation of an electronic kind going on. But if one day we were to meet, then I would become acquainted with Ricardo Lopez. I would experience the phenomenon about which I had learned indirectly in a first-hand, direct manner. And so the thought is that there are certain facts about the human mind, about one's own mind, that are quite easy to know about indirectly through inference and reasoning and testimony, but are harder to know about directly. And my view is that the psychedelic experience can enable one to gain this sort of knowledge by acquaintance, or become more directly aware of these properties of one's own mind. And I have in mind here things like the fact that the mind has this vast potential that usually goes untapped and unrealized, right? The mind has potential for, well, the kinds of states I was just talking about, states of mindfulness, states of spaciousness, and of relating to thoughts and feelings in this kind of non-reactive, objective sort of way. But it also has immense capacity for feelings of wonder and awe and harmony and bliss. And, we're all familiar from, ordinary sober waking life with these sorts of feelings to some extent. Almost all of us have had some feelings of wonder, of awe, of rapture, of harmony, of bliss. But a lot of the time, unless someone's sort of had a spontaneous mystical experience, if they haven't had psychedelics, they don't really know, they don't really grasp just how vast that capacity is. They can read trip reports, they can read books by Aldous Huxley or whatever, and they can think, yeah, it sounds like it's possible for my mind to experience, far greater states of harmony, bliss, wonder, rapture, and awe than I ever have experienced. But it's very hard to come directly into contact with that potential of the mind. And then this is what the right sort of pharmacological stimulation can do. And then there are other things as well, like the fact that it's possible to have these sorts of selfless states of consciousness, experiences lacking a sense of self. All these things about the mind you can know about indirectly pretty easily, but psychedelic experiences allow people to know these facts about their own mind in a much more direct, vivid, and intimate way, and that can be really transformative. I mean, you get people coming out of the experience saying, the single most important part of that was that I now know directly from my own first-hand experience that it really is possible for my mind to experience these sorts of states. So it's not kind of it's not just an idle curiosity, but this gaining of knowledge by acquaintance with the potential of the mind and with the sort of constructed and mutable, changeable nature of the sense of self is, I think, actually very closely tied up with the mechanisms that underlie therapeutic effects of psychedelics.
So I think we still have time for one last question. So again, from a naturalistic perspective, do you think it makes sense, or are there any psychedelically induced transformative experiences that we could legitimately call spiritual, even if we have to have a specific kind of definition of spiritual in mind?
Yeah, I do. And I think this is one of the interesting sort of philosophical debates to which psychedelic evidence can contribute something. So, recently a number of philosophers and other sort of philosophically inclined thinkers have been exploring the possibility of a naturalistic spirituality. So asking the question, if we think that naturalism is the correct worldview or the most plausible worldview, is there still something that we can really call spirituality, something that, matches the description of spirituality, that is something that we as naturalists can engage in sort of all sincerity and intellectual honesty and good faith? And so a number of people have argued that yes, there is, and they might have different positions about the word spiritual, but the general feeling is, well, there is a set of kind of experiences and practices, domains of human existence that, for better or worse, we use this word to refer to. And in fact, yes, some of those experiences and practices and so on are things that naturalists can engage in intellectual good faith. They are things that you can engage in sincerely and seriously without needing to believe in anything metaphysically non-naturalistic. And so you get various different accounts. A number of people have given accounts of naturalistic spirituality, from Sam Harris, the neuroscientist, to philosophers like Owen Flanagan, biologists like Ursula Goodenough. And so there's a paper by Jerome Stone in which he sort of synthesizes several of these accounts and extracts a common core. And it's basically that, Naturalistic spirituality has all to do with connections, so feelings of profound connectedness to something other than ourselves or something bigger than ourselves. It has to do with aspiration, so aspiring to kind of realize our values. And it has to do with contemplating the big questions, so questions about the nature and origins of consciousness and, why is there something rather than nothing and all this kind of thing. And Stone suggests that the common thread uniting all of these is that they're all ways of breaking through the narrow walls of the ego. And so I think that basically you get convergent evidence for that kind of idea when you look at the findings from psychedelic science. And so, again, the idea is it's similar to what I was talking about with the self. The idea is that looking at findings from psychedelic science can help with the conceptual question: what is spirituality? What do we mean when we talk about spirituality? And obviously, these kinds of terms and concepts fluctuate and change and evolve, and different people have different conceptions. But the thought is, we can get some kind of a beat on at least some of the main ways that this term is being used in the present day and the sorts of things people mean when they talk about something being spiritual, if we look at the conditions under which people will spontaneously apply this term, right? So what are the sorts of experiences, practices that people tend to be willing to call spiritual, and what are the things that they tend to think are not spiritual? And so you can get evidence about this from psychedelic research, because you have all these studies in which people are being asked, was this experience, one of the top 5 most spiritually significant of your life, and things like that. And so it turns out that people's willingness to say, yes, this experience was spiritually significant, in some studies at least, correlates quite closely with this construct of a mystical type experience. So, and you also find in anecdotal reports, right, people reaching for spiritual as the best word or the only word that really encapsulates what has happened to them and the meaning and significance of their psychedelic experience. And you find that that's true whether they're naturalists or non-naturalists. So the thought is that, look, there's something about these experiences that is paradigmatically spiritual, something that gets to the heart of what we mean by that term and what that concept is, because people with otherwise very different views about it all seem to agree that, that's the best word, or that's the only word to encapsulate these experiences. So the thought is, all right, psychedelic experiences are paradigmatically spiritual. They somehow get to the heart of what that concept means for us. So in that case, if we want to know whether spirituality is compatible with a naturalistic outlook, then one way to find out is to look at these psychedelic experiences and to see whether they are compatible with a naturalistic outlook. And again, you seem to have this link between people saying this experience was spiritually significant and ticking the boxes for a complete mystical type experience. So that suggests that that might be the sort of experience you would want to look at. And so obviously, as I said earlier, my position is that the construct of a complete mystical type experience refers to a category of experiences that very often doesn't include non-naturalistic metaphysics, right? It very often doesn't include any apparent encounter with an afterlife, a godhead, a cosmic consciousness, a ground of being. What it always includes, though, is changes to the sense of self. It always includes, as Stone puts it, some form of breaking through the narrow walls of the ego. And in fact, I think the convergence with that sort of literature review and synthesis, that paper he has on spirituality for naturalists, is quite amazing, right? Because he says, if you get together all these accounts, then these are the common themes: connection, aspiration, and asking the big questions, and they're all forms of breaking through the narrow walls of the ego. And that just maps onto psychedelic experience, at least as I understand it, in the account I develop, so precisely. It's like, the core of these experiences, one of the most consistent and distinctive features is changes to the sense of self of one kind or another, changes to self-awareness, changes to self-representation. And as an empirical matter, you simply find that, yes, this is what happens: connection, aspiration, and asking the big questions. So work by, researchers at Imperial College, Ros Watts, Robin Carhart Harris, and so on, has highlighted the fact that connectedness is one of the most common features that people describe in the psychedelic experience. very often you get people talking about reconnecting with their values and kind of aspiring to be a different version of themselves or a better version of themselves. And reflection on the big questions is absolutely rife. Even when you don't have any kind of sense that, report that I encountered universal consciousness or a deity or divinity, very, very common to get people coming out of these experiences saying, I started thinking about questions like, why was there something rather than nothing, and what happened before the Big Bang, and this kind of thing. So yeah, this is another part where, the psychedelic evidence on its own doesn't kind of seal the deal, but I think it provides an important contribution, especially given the convergent nature of the evidence. I think it really bolsters this idea that, yeah, there is such a thing as spirituality for naturalists, and yes, it is really all about connection, aspiration, and asking the big questions as ways of breaking through the narrow walls of the ego.
Okay, great. So the book is again Philosophy of Psychedelics. Apart from the book, are there any good places on the internet where people can find your work?
Yeah, I have a website. I don't know if I'd say it's a good place. It's a bit dodgy, but chrisletheby.com, and most of my papers in one form or another are available to download there.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Letheby, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Ricardo.
Hi, guys. Thank you for watching the interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show. It's thanks to people like you that it keeps running. I will leave links in the description box to Patreon and PayPal. Any amount, even just $1 per month, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Parerga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Ernst Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enrique Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreff, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslan Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Des Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidi, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Staffini, Keon Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Thomas Trumbull, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.